Welcome to Level the Playing Field, where we explore topics related to economics, equity, women, work, and money. My name is Katie Ward, and I'm Commissioner and CAO of Ontario's Pay Equity Commission. Today, we're talking with Lauren McKeon. Lauren is Deputy Editor at Reader's Digest Canada and author of F-Bomb, Dispatches from the War on Feminism, No More Nice Girls, Gender Power and Why It's Time to Stop Playing by the Rules, and most recently, Women of the Pandemic, Stories of the Front Lines of COVID-19. Lauren, your research in journalism has uncovered stories and trends about women, work, and equity, with your most recent excellent book highlighting how the story of the pandemic was very different for women, and that in many ways, the story of the pandemic is the story of women. Thank you so much for joining us today to share your insights on this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you have covered gender inequalities, gender and power, gender and inclusion, and racialized aspects of both gender and power for working women. What has your research uncovered about women, work, and equity, broadly speaking?
You know, I could probably talk about this for hours, but I won't. Don't worry. But I think, there's so much. And this is such rich terrain, but also, such devastating terrain too. And I think, broadly speaking, I can say that I've learned women have fought so many incredible battles over even the past few years, but decades, going back centuries. They fought to be in the workplace at all. They fought to gain even like a bit of a foothold for what they do have in the workplace across all industries. They've pushed to be in more leadership positions. They've pushed for the equity, that we do have in the workplace. But, and they're still pushing. And I don't want to discount those hard wins and those hard victories. But I think, if anything, I've learned, as we always kind of say in feminist circles, even though we've come so far, we have so much further to go.
Absolutely. Progress is being made, but it's incremental.
Yeah.
I mean, your research is so rich across these three books, and not just the books, but also work you've done as a journalist. What are some of the realities of inequity for women at work that you've uncovered in your research, that you've told stories about and shared?
This is another one of those lists that, unfortunately can be depressingly long. There are a lot of inequities that persist. And that's because the systems are so complicated that, that we have to go against. And we see particularly a lot of those inequities in the STEM industries, of course, where, women, and I would say, all genders, are fighting for equal representation. They're fighting for equal pay. They're fighting to be treated well within those workplaces, to have their ideas and their voices heard. They're fighting for leadership. So, that persists. But, even beyond that, we see, there are racial inequalities that, again, are persistent and pervasive and are threaded through STEM, certainly, and I've spoken to many women who just have horrific stories to share, as a journalist, but also in my own life, my friends who are in those industries and, and just face a fight almost every day to, to get their voices heard, to be valued at work, to feel that they are equal, team members. But beyond that, we still see disabled women fighting, to have equal representation in the workforce. We see LGBTQ women fighting to have equal representation in the workforce. There are, those big battles of representation, but then there's also those day-to-day battles, that probably a lot of us can have a lot of empathy for, where we see, studies that women are interrupted more at work. We see that their ideas are very easily dismissed, but then co-opted by male coworkers. We've seen just the little struggles that we do have. And then you layer sexism and harassment and, those day-to-day things that can just bring you down. And it's just this messy, stewy place that a lot of us are fighting for success and are fighting to bring other, to make it better for everybody.
Yeah, thank you for pointing out the broader sort of structural, as you said, that you pointed to STEM, and that's a sector, right? And there's clearly structural issues that keep women out of those sectors that are very large, but then also, as you said, the sort of tacit daily ways by, you know, being interrupted or ideas not taken seriously, these sort of small things that are happening daily, which could be dismissed as, oh, that's just a little thing, but it adds up to a very big barrier for women. So, which, you know, brings me to my next question, which I know in your books you've addressed a lot of this, is sort of restructuring or shifting these structures of inequality really calls for restructuring or shifting several of the complex interrelated systems. And you started to talk about that in your previous answer. Can you share more insight in what you've learned? Like, what are some of those systems, and what are the stories you've heard or you've uncovered in your research about those particular larger structural issues that you're talking about?
Right. I often think of it like a ball of like messy yarn, like, you know, like this big old ball of yarn. And, you know, you start to try and unravel one structure, and then you find that, you know, it's tied to another structure and another knot over here. And, you know, we see that with the systems that we do have. We have systems, you know, that uphold racism, systems, and were built in racism, you know, systems that were built in colonialism and uphold that, and then systems, of course, that uphold sexism, and they're all intertwined together, which is why, you know, intersectionality is so important, and it is so important for us to acknowledge that you can't try and unravel one of these knots over here without also addressing one of these other knots. Because when we think about, you know, the progress that we've made, we also have to be realistic that you know, equality doesn't just mean a bunch of white women like myself, you know, cisgender white women with privilege sitting at the table, or, you know, being finally in positions of leadership and power, or being able to have the freedom to pursue the jobs that we want and the careers that we want and the lifestyle we want. It means, you know, everyone being able to do that. And I think, you know, I've spoken to and interviewed so many, you know, young women of color, you know, Indigenous women, trans women, who are looking at these systems and saying, maybe this one, you know, way forward, or this one program, or this one movement helps some people, but it doesn't necessarily help me, which is why a lot of my research focuses on, you know, tearing it all down and really rebuilding something that from the start is built in a different way, you know, is built in collaboration and kindness and compassion. And, you know, it's built with inclusion in mind. And, you know, I think that, you know, there's so many young women across many industries, whether it's film, technology, business, government, you know, who want to see these things done differently, because they do realize that we are working with, you know, that big messy ball of yarn where everything is so deeply intertwined.
You've talked about in all your books, actually, this is one thing I appreciate your writing, is you point out the problem, but you also point out how things are happening, which I think it's great to know that there's challenges, but there are women who are making a difference. Not just women, there's men, there's communities and agencies that are doing things to change. What are the ways that you've seen in your stories, or the areas where women have actually made progress in making these shifts? You know, what have been the impacts of the progress that you've witnessed or that you've written about? And why aren't we talking about these gains? I mean, you're a journalist you're doing the research and you're saying, here's a problem, here's something happening around it, or you're giving calls to actions, but, you know, why isn't that happening more? So sort of a two-parter question on, like, you've seen the progress and the impact of it, but why aren't we talking about it?
You know, yeah, well, I answer the progress. Let's answer the positive part first, you know, when we talk about, you know, the progress. And I think, you know, certainly my second book, No More Nice Girls, really looked at the ways in which people were changing that structure, were unraveling, you know, that ball of yarn, and we're finding new ways to lead and finding new meanings of success. And, you know, that could be, I spoke to a group of women who had made a new greeting card company. So it could be something, and I was speaking to them and they'd be like, oh, you're also speaking, to, business leaders and government members, like, what about us? Like, why us? But I found it so fascinating that these three women had looked at, back when we could go into stores and browse, had looked at, these walls of cards and said, no one looks like me in these cards. These Hallmark moments are all for young white women, and they're celebrating things that maybe are not culturally relevant to me. So, they made a greeting card company that featured women of color, that, had cards for things that were maybe not life moments that we're taught to celebrate, but broke out of that mold, cards for, happy breakup from that guy that wasn't any good, or happy first job, or happy being happy as a single person, breaking sort of those status quo moments. And I thought that was incredible. We need stuff like that. We need artists and people that are doing art differently, and that's a positive story. I spoke to women in tech, one woman in tech that had made a bot that did the hard work of talking back to, misogynist, gross, trolling comments, and her bot just went through and did it for her, and that's another fun way to do it. I spoke to women that were reimagining what their cities look like and how to make safe cities for women, and how the very structure of these places that we walk through need to change in order to make things better for everyone.
Absolutely.
And I've spoken to businesses that have taken a trauma-centered business approach, and you're like, well, what does that mean? And it's, women business leaders who want to do business differently and acknowledge that, there are a lot of women who have faced trauma, and maybe, we should normalize that it's okay to need a mental health day if you went through something really tough, or we should normalize that, hey, sometimes maybe you do have to cry at work, and that doesn't mean that you're weak. Maybe it's a sign of compassion. So I think I've just talked to so many people that have looked at the structures and said, that doesn't work for me, I don't fit in there, and then have changed it or built something completely new that is incredible and inspiring. And I think why we don't hear about those stories, though, why we don't hear about these people doing these things, is such a good question. And I think, part of my answer is very cynical, because I think that part of the reason we don't hear about them is because they are breaking the status quo. They are doing things differently. And in so many ways, it's a bit of a threat to see, it is, and I shouldn't laugh, because, that is very serious, but it's in some ways, it's like, well, of course we're not hearing about them, because, these are the ways in which we are going to start tearing down those inequities, and we're going to start unraveling that ball of yarn. And I think that, for some people who've had power for so long and don't want to see that change, that's deeply threatening. And it's so much easier to keep us thinking that we can't change and we can't see these positive stories and these new ways of being and leading and doing and finding success.
Absolutely. I think in some ways there is a vested interest in keeping the narrative supporting the status quo, right? Because then it's always been this way, and it's going to continue along this trajectory. So it takes, authors like you and hopefully this series to really bring in the alternative narrative that says, yes, progress is being made. It's incremental, but it's happening. And I think that's one thing I really admire about your work, is that, as I said, you're able to find those stories to demonstrate, where the shifts are happening and where women are stepping out of status quo and doing something that shifts it. I'm going to build off of your research in No More Nice Girls. I really appreciated that book. In it, your research notes that when it comes to the complexity of the intersections between gender power and inclusion of women and other excluded communities, that the process of inclusion, and this is a quote, is not about demanding a seat at the table at all. It's about building your own table and making it look completely different, which you've alluded to. So the inequalities exposed through the pandemic, and it's been building over the past few years, decades, in many ways have made it apparent that as economic recovery unfolds, we've started to shift the way we look at equity, pay equity, racial justice, and all of the inequalities going forward. So, linking that to the research of your latest book, Women of the Pandemic, and what you've revealed about the way women are actually building their own table as we build back better. What are some of those stories? Because you really, it was compelling because you brought the reader to the traumatic space of the nurse and to the unbelievably stressful, difficult moments of frontline workers like cashiers and what they were, the struggles they had. But then you also brought the reader to the other side where women were starting to build their own tables and really shift the way that even governments were responding to it. So, what are some of the things that you learned through the research in that book?
Yeah, it was, and it's interesting that you said, a few years, then, well, decades, and I think it is, and I think the pandemic, didn't create the inequities that we saw so deeply emerge, but I think what it did is it shone a spotlight on some of these inequities, and it made them so undeniable, that we cannot look away from the ways in which women sacrificed during the pandemic, the ways in which they lost the most, economically, certainly. But, the vulnerable positions that they were put in. And, by and large, it was a lot of women who were those essential workers, who were our PSWs, who were our nurses, who were put in these places where, we saw that they weren't supported. And that wasn't new, but certainly it became just so undeniable. You just couldn't look away from it. And I think that is what helped or pushed a lot of women to say, well, why do we want to return to normal? Like normal wasn't working for us so well. Why do we want to return to normal? Well, where, we are just fighting for a seat at the table, where we just want to kind of have a voice, but not necessarily change the narrative. And I think that, the pandemic has shown us that, women can change the narrative. If there is any silver lining to what has been a horrible time, I think it is that we've seen women leaders emerge in their communities, in their workplaces, in our governments as health leaders. When I wrote No More Nice Girls, it was all about exploring these alternative ways of leadership and community and success. And I remember thinking, I found these examples, but it's going to be a really long time before we embrace these women leaders and these different ways of leadership and this idea of, building our own table, building our own way to lead. And that book came out like a week before the pandemic started. And then, but then we saw those shifts like far faster than I saw. We saw Canada and, world leaders everywhere, or countries embrace their world leaders everywhere, embrace women's leadership. We saw Canada embrace people like Dr. Bonnie Henry, Dr. Dina Hinshaw. We saw them embrace, this way of compassion and kindness and vulnerability and openness. And, we heard that that's what got them through the pandemic. And I think, we have seen now that not only can women leaders succeed in a crisis in a way that, the narrative was very skeptical about before, the mainstream narrative, we've seen that they can excel and they can lead us through, and that we can see these different ways of leaderships and these different tables. So I think, the pandemic has given us that silver lining, and has given us sort of like a, as collective, as a society, has given us sort of the push to see like how deeply we do need women leaders and women's sometimes way of doing things differently. It's not only women that do things differently. It's not only women that exhibit these qualities, but, we've come to associate them with women. And now we can see that's actually an incredible thing.
Yeah, exactly. The Women of the Pandemic is such a good job of demonstrating, and this is controversy. Some women in feminist groups don't want to say, oh well, you shouldn't talk about women as being compassionate and empathetic and all this, but it's a sensitive subject. But I agree with you that there is research that proves that women lead differently, and in your book you really outline a bit globally, but certainly across Canada, how especially there was a lot of chief doctors who were women across the country who were making very vital and crucial decisions. And in Women of the Pandemic, you document, this is a quote from your book, women have never before played such a vital, essential role in the global crisis. And that also, on the other hand, that they've also been the ones that suffered most. And you point out these amazing small acts of leadership, like the caremonger movement, which everybody read the book just to read about the caremongers. So good. But then you also told really personal stories about frontline workers, women in long haul trucking, long-term care, nursing, food processing, grocery, like all of these essential workplaces that many people just didn't consider, right? We heard a lot about nursing, but other ones. So, how have you seen these women provide that blueprint? You sort of alluded to it in your previous answer, but how have you seen them provide that blueprint for moving forward more equitably? Because that's essentially what they did, is they just started doing things differently in their own way, which was inclusive and equitable.
Yeah, I think, that we've seen, and I think just to speak a little bit to the leadership, like, yes, it is very controversial to say that women lead differently. And I think my hope is, and I think the pandemic exposed this too, is that, by embracing so-called women's leadership qualities, it'll open the door for all genders to feel that they can lead differently, or feel that, that leadership isn't put in a tiny box and you can only lead one way. And I think that, we can see how that has rippled out and expanded to other blueprints. And I think it's not necessarily that, women by doing things have built a new blueprint, because, a lot of them I've spoken to is like, well, I've always done this. This is my job. This is what I want to do. I did this before the pandemic, and I'm going to keep doing this after the pandemic. What I think has changed is that by doing these things, by leading and, leading through their communities the way that they've always done, or doing, the essential vital jobs that they've always done, during this particular time, we have finally underscored how vital those jobs are. And, it's the rest of us that weren't paying attention that are starting to see the blueprints and the way forward. And I think, the pandemic, and a lot of women that I spoke to, have said that, these problems exist before, they're going to exist after. But what the pandemic has shown them is that, if everything kind of unravel in a short amount of time, we've seen that there's also a great potential to rebuild. And I think that's the other side of it, is that we're seeing, okay, these systems didn't work. They crumbled during the pandemic. We saw them crumble. We saw, the most vulnerable lose. We saw women in these positions face incredible risk and lose. But what we've also seen is that, now we can build something, a way forward. Once we hear their stories and we honor their stories and we listen to their stories, they're inspiring and devastating stories all kind of, bundled into one, we can build a way forward with those stories in mind. So I think, that is what has changed, is that we have this opportunity right now to rebuild. And now we can do so hearing those stories and building something that puts those people first instead of actively ignores them.
Yes, absolutely. Lauren, thank you so much for your research, for the stories you've told in your many books. For the viewers who haven't picked up any of your work, I would encourage them to I read all 3 books, but Women of the Pandemic is a remarkable story. It's, a great read on both the unequal toll of the pandemic, but also how women have led the way through COVID-19. Lauren, can you remind me your website?
It's just my name. So it's pretty easy. So it's laurenmckeon.net.
Perfect. So folks go there to find information about her exceptional research. This conversation is part of a series published by the Pay Equity Commission of Ontario to examine economics, equity, women, work, and money. You can learn more at leveltheplayingfield.ca. And please share this video on your social platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn so we can elevate the equity conversation.